Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a incredibly dense 30-page Philippine Supreme Court decision and unpacking it into a high-stakes legal drama all about property, power, and the Constitution. We're going to be digging into a really fascinating legal battle between the Manila International Ports Terminal, Incorporated, which we'll just call MIPTI, and the Philippine Ports Authority. It's a story that seriously has it all: a dramatic government takeover, hundreds of millions of pesos on the line, and a massive fundamental clash over constitutional rights.
Picture this scenario for a second. You spend years building a massive, highly profitable business. You've got millions invested in heavy equipment, infrastructure, your personnel. And then, literally almost overnight, the government just decides to seize the whole thing. There's no formal investigation, no lengthy court battles beforehand, and barely even a day's notice. I know, it sounds exactly like a movie plot, but this is precisely what went down at the Port of Manila back in July of 1986.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the overnight port takeover.
To really grasp the sheer speed of what happened, we need to look at how frantically this timeline unfolded. And honestly, it brilliantly illustrates exactly why the Supreme Court called this undue haste. Okay, so at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday, the Philippine Ports Authority hits MIPT with a notice outlining some alleged violations and demands a full response by 9 a.m. the very next morning. MIPT miraculously manages to submit a reply on Saturday morning, completely denying everything. But on that exact same Saturday, the president issues Executive Order number 30, revoking MIPT's franchise entirely. By Sunday, the PPA turns around and issues a permit to a direct competitor, MetroStar. And by Monday morning, an armed takeover of the Manila ports. We're talking going from a warning letter to armed guards at the gates in less than 72 hours over a weekend. If only the DMV moved that fast, right?
Now, you're probably wondering, what on earth did MIPTI allegedly do to trigger such a massive and sudden response? Well, the PPA claimed MIPTI was just failing miserably in its port operations. They threw out a laundry list of issues: unpaid claims, dilapidated equipment, unilaterally jacking up their rates without approval, unreturned deposits, and even holding cargo hostage until port personnel were given incentives. Obviously, those are massive, serious allegations of mismanagement. But remember the context here. The PPA demanded a complete, formal, legal response to these incredibly complex operational charges in less than 24 hours.
Moving right along, let's look at Section 2, the Executive Order Defense. We need to look at how the government legally justified such an abrupt and aggressive seizure of a private corporation. They didn't just walk in unannounced. They brought a massive legal hammer with them. They leaned heavily on Executive Order 30, which was issued by President Corazon Aquino under the 1986 Freedom Constitution. Because this was a revolutionary government that had literally just taken power, the president actually held plenary legislative powers until a new legislature could be properly elected. So this executive order wasn't just some standard administrative memo. It carried the full weight of a legislative act, explicitly recalling MIPTI's franchise and authorizing the PPA to immediately take over the port complex.
So the ultimate showdown boils down to this fundamental clash of arguments. On one side, you have the PPA arguing that the state has this absolute plenary power to revoke a franchise for the public good, especially to prevent the collapse of something as vital as port operations, and EO 30 gave them the authority to just take it over immediately. On the flip side, MIPTI fought back hard. They argued that a franchise is a property right, pure and simple, and revoking it without any proper hearing or investigation, they said that was fundamentally unconstitutional.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Due Process Shield. When the dust finally settled and this case made its way up to the Supreme Court, the justices had to answer the million-dollar legal question. Even with plenary legislative power, and even when claiming to act in the name of the public good, can the state just take your franchise away without a fair hearing? Is a franchise just some special privilege that they can snatch back on a whim? To answer that, the Supreme Court pointed directly to procedural due process. They defined it as the ultimate constitutional safeguard. It's the thing that guarantees fairness, reason, and justice, free from caprice and arbitrariness. The court acknowledged that, sure, historically, a franchise originated as a royal privilege, but modern law has evolved. Individuals and businesses simply cannot be subjected to the unfettered whims of government officials. The Supreme Court came down incredibly hard on the government's actions here. They ruled that even though a franchise is technically a privilege, it is still a property right, and it is absolutely protected by the Due Process Clause. The fact that the PPA totally failed to conduct any actual investigation into those alleged violations made the takeover completely illegal.
The PPA actually had a memorandum of agreement that strictly required a proper investigation before recommending any revocation, and they just entirely disregarded it. The court noted that the bare minimum standards of fair play were thrown right out the window.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, counting the cost. Because once an act is actually declared illegal, the courts have to figure out how to compensate the victim, and the math on this one gets wild. Originally, the trial court awarded MIPT a massive 180 million pesos just for the seized equipment. They based that on current replacement prices, plus an additional 1.5 million pesos per month and lost profits. But when it reached the Supreme Court, they slashed that equipment award all the way down to just 19 million pesos. Why the huge drop? Well, the trial court used the price of brand new equipment. The Supreme Court correctly pointed out that you have to factor in depreciation because machinery obviously wears out over time. They actually used MIPT's very own financial statements to peg the true depreciated value at 19 million. And even more drastically, the Supreme Court completely wiped out the award for lost profits. They brought it straight down to zero.
So, you're probably asking yourself, how could they possibly get zero lost profits when their entire business was illegally seized? Well, the Supreme Court laid it out like this. While a franchise is protected by due process, it isn't a guarantee of future profits. Congress can revoke a franchise at any time if public interest requires it, meaning there is zero vested right to expect future gains. On top of that, the PPA was acting under the direct orders of the President's Executive Order 30. And finally, the profits MIPT was making came from the franchise services themselves, not merely the physical equipment that was seized.
But okay, brace yourself for the biggest financial twist of the entire case. Because this legal battle dragged on in the background for decades, over those intervening years, MIPTI had actually collected over 34.6 million pesos in rental payments. The replacement operators had been paying them to use their seized equipment. Now remember, the true depreciated value of that equipment was only 19 million pesos. Because of that, the court ruled that MIPTI had actually been overcompensated. So instead of walking away with a massive payout, MIPTI was ordered to return the 15.6 million peso excess back to the government. Now, even though MIPTI didn't get that massive windfall they initially won in the trial court, the Supreme Court still had to legally recognize the technical violation of MIPTI's constitutional rights. To do that, they awarded 1 million pesos in nominal damages, purely to vindicate that right. And they didn't stop there. The court also slapped the Philippine Ports Authority with 200,000 pesos in exemplary damages. This was designed specifically as a punishment. The court really wanted to make an example of the PPA for acting in bad faith with undue haste and for executing this incredibly oppressive takeover without even bothering to verify the allegations first. Finally, that brings us to Section 5, why due process matters. What is the core takeaway from this decades-old legal battle? Well, the Supreme Court closed their decision with a really powerful thought, specifically noting the historical irony of the whole situation. They wrote, "It is ironic that months after toppling a dictator who desecrated the Bill of Rights, the revolutionary government carried out the same evil. There can be no excuse for it." It's a stark reminder that even a well-intentioned government, acting in what it truly believes is the public interest, simply cannot bypass fundamental constitutional safeguards. I'm going to leave you with this thought to chew on. Constitutional due process isn't just legal red tape. It exists for a reason, to protect your business, your licenses, and your property from arbitrary government seizure. If the standard of fairness and reason is just ignored by the state, how fragile are our rights really?